December 20th, 1941, shortly after dawn. The skies above Kunming, China. 10 Japanese bombers cruised toward the city at 15,000 feet. Their crews relaxed, confident. They have bombed Kunming before, many times. 2 days ago, their raid killed 400 Chinese civilians on the ground. No one stopped them then. No one has ever stopped them. For more than 4 years, Japanese aircraft have ranged freely over Chinese skies, bombing cities at will, strafing columns of refugees, terrorizing a nation that lacks the air power to fight back. The pilots scan the empty sky ahead, check their instruments, and adjust their course for the final run to target. Their fighter escort turned back at the Indo-China border, deemed unnecessary for another milk run against a defenseless city. Below them, Kunming spreads across a high plateau at 5,000 feet elevation, a maze of ancient walls and modern buildings clustered around the terminus of the Burma Road. That road is China's last lifeline to the outside world, the only route through which supplies can reach Chiang Kai-shek's beleaguered nationalist forces. In minutes, these bombers will add their ordnance to the suffering of a city that has already endured dozens of such attacks. In minutes, more civilians will die. In minutes, they will turn for home, another effortless mission complete. They do not see the 16 American fighters climbing toward them from the direction of the morning sun. They do not know that a retired American captain they have never heard of has spent 4 years studying their tactics, analyzing their aircraft, and developing a method to defeat them. They do not know that everything they believe about air combat is about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The Curtiss P-40 Tomahawks are painted with 12-pointed Chinese stars on their wings and vicious shark teeth around their massive chin-mounted radiator air intakes. They are flown by American volunteers who resigned their military commissions months ago to fight for a foreign nation in a war their own country had not yet entered. And they are commanded by a leathery Texan named Claire Lee Chennault, a man the United States Army Air Corps considered a crackpot, a troublemaker, a radical whose theories about fighter tactics were dismissed as dangerous fantasy by his own superiors. The Japanese bombers never complete their bombing run. The shark-mouthed fighters scream down from above in near-vertical dives, their machine guns blazing, closing at combined speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. The Americans do not try to turn with the bombers. They do not slow down to engage in circling combat. They slash through the formation in a single devastating pass, then keep diving, pulling away at speeds no Japanese aircraft can match, climbing back up to altitude to repeat the attack. Within minutes, 3 bombers are falling from the sky, trailing smoke and flame, their crews dead or dying. A 4th staggers toward the Indo-China border, mortally wounded, its pilot desperately trying to nurse a failing aircraft home. It crashes before reaching its base. Chinese intelligence will later intercept Japanese communications, confirming that only one of the 10 bombers that launched that morning ever returned. The pilots who just achieved this victory have been in combat for exactly 0 days. They have never fired their guns at a living enemy before this morning. They are members of the American Volunteer Group, and within days, newspapers across America will give them a name that will echo through the decades: the Flying Tigers. Over the next 7 months, these pilots will destroy 296 Japanese aircraft while losing only 4 of their own pilots in aerial combat. Another 10 would die from ground fire, accidents, and other causes, but the air-to-air record would remain astonishing. A kill ratio of more than 70-1 against an enemy that was simultaneously sweeping British, Dutch, and American air forces from the skies across the Pacific. They achieved this impossible record by following one counterintuitive rule that contradicted everything fighter pilots were taught about aerial combat. Never try to outmaneuver a Japanese fighter. Dive away instead. The man who taught them that rule, the man who built this squadron from nothing and trained these pilots to fight in ways no one else believed would work, had spent 20 years preparing for this moment. His name was Claire Lee Chennault. And the story of how he created the Flying Tigers begins not in the skies over China, but in the swamps of Louisiana and the classrooms of an Army Air Corps that wanted nothing to do with him or his ideas. Claire Lee Chennault was born September 6, 1893, in Commerce, Texas, a small farming town in the cotton country about 60 miles northeast of Dallas. His father, John Stonewall Jackson Chennault, was a farmer who struggled to make a living from the difficult soil. His mother, Jessie Lee, came from a family that claimed connection to the Confederate General Robert E. Lee, though the genealogical link remains uncertain. When Claire was barely a month old, the family moved to northeastern Louisiana, settling in the rural community of Gilbert in Franklin Parish, where the bayous wound through cypress swamps and dense hardwood forests. The boy grew up running through those woods, learning to hunt and fish in the backwater lakes, developing the fierce independence and self-reliance that would define his entire career. He later wrote in his memoirs that those years roaming the Louisiana wilds taught him to make his own decisions and trust his own judgment, lessons that would serve him well when the entire military establishment told him he was wrong. He learned to read the weather, to understand how animals moved through terrain, to think tactically about approach and escape. Without knowing it, he was developing the mindset of a fighter pilot decades before he ever saw an airplane. Chennault attended Louisiana State University from 1909 to 1910, but financial difficulties forced him to drop out after a single year. He transferred to Louisiana State Normal School in Natchitoches, where he completed a teaching degree in 1910. For the next several years, he worked as a school teacher in small towns across Louisiana and Mississippi, including a stint as principal of a small school in Kilburn, Louisiana. It was respectable work, but it did not satisfy the restless ambition burning inside him. On Christmas Eve, 1911, Claire Chennault married Neale Thompson, a young woman he had met at a high school graduation ceremony in Winsboro, Louisiana. They would have 8 children together over the following decades. But even as he built a family, Chennault felt trapped in his provincial life, yearning for something bigger, something more consequential. The arrival of World War I would finally give him the opportunity he craved. When America entered the conflict in April 1917, Chennault immediately enlisted in the army. He was 23 years old, burning with the same determination that drove thousands of young men to the recruiting stations. He had seen photographs of aerial combat over the Western Front, read accounts of the aces whose exploits filled newspapers, and he knew with complete certainty that aviation was his future. He earned his commission as a first lieutenant in the Infantry Reserve after completing officers' training camp at Fort Benjamin Harrison in Indiana in November 1917. Almost immediately, he requested transfer to the aviation section of the Signal Corps and was accepted for flight training. The war ended before he could see combat in France, but Chennault remained in the service, determined to master the new art of aerial warfare. He earned his wings and his rating as a pursuit pilot in April 1922 at Ellington Field, Texas, a disappointment at missing the war that would fuel his drive for the next 2 decades. Unlike many of his contemporaries who returned to civilian life when peace came, Chennault chose to remain in the Army Air Service. He had found his calling. He would spend the rest of his life in the cockpit, or as close to it as the peacetime military would allow. Throughout the 1920s, Chennault served in a variety of assignments across the expanding air service, which became the Army Air Corps in 1926. He flew border patrol missions along the Rio Grande in Texas from 1919 to 1923. He served with pursuit squadrons in Hawaii from 1923 to 1926, honing his skills as a fighter pilot in the tropical skies above Pearl Harbor. He became known as an exceptional aviator, fearless in the air, aggressive in mock combat, innovative in his thinking about tactics and formations. He was also developing a reputation as difficult, argumentative, and utterly unwilling to back down from superiors he believed were wrong. In an era when military careers depended heavily on political connections and the ability to go along with prevailing wisdom, Chennault seemed incapable of keeping his opinions to himself. He argued with colonels. He contradicted generals. He insisted that pursuit aviation, the branch of the Air Corps he had devoted his career to, was not obsolete, even as the service's leadership was reaching exactly the opposite conclusion. In 1930, Chennault was selected to attend the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field in Montgomery, Alabama. This was the intellectual center of American military aviation, the place where the service's best minds gathered to study and debate the future of air power. Graduating from the tactical school was essential for advancement to senior ranks. For Chennault, it was also the beginning of a collision course with the Air Corps establishment that would ultimately destroy his career. The dominant theory at the tactical school in the early 1930s held that strategic bombing would be the decisive factor in future wars. Advocates of this theory, who would later be called the bomber mafia, believed that large formations of heavy bombers flying high above enemy defenses could penetrate to an enemy nation's heartland and destroy its industrial capacity, its transportation networks, its will to resist. The bomber, they proclaimed with absolute confidence, would always get through. This theory had profound implications for pursuit aviation. If bombers could not be stopped, then pursuit aircraft were fundamentally obsolete. Their only role would be local defense of airfields and supply depots, a secondary mission of declining importance. The future belonged to the bomber. Resources should flow to bomber development, bomber production, bomber training. Pursuit was yesterday's weapon. Claire Chennault heard this theory and knew it was wrong. His years of flying pursuit aircraft, his study of aerial combat in the World War, his own experiments with tactics and formations had convinced him that fighters could intercept and destroy bomber formations if they were properly trained, properly equipped, and properly warned of incoming attacks. The bomber would not always get through, not if he had anything to say about it. After graduating from the tactical school in 1931, Chennault was assigned to remain there as head of the pursuit section, responsible for training and doctrine development. It was a prestigious position that gave him a platform to advocate for his theories. He used it relentlessly. Chennault argued that pursuit aircraft, working in coordinated formations and guided by ground-based early warning systems, could find, intercept, and destroy any bomber formation before it reached its targets. He developed new tactics, emphasizing teamwork between aircraft, mutual support between flight members, attacks from altitude using the dive to build speed. He experimented with radio communications and ground observer networks to provide advance warning of approaching enemy aircraft. To demonstrate his ideas, Chennault organized an aerobatic exhibition team called 3 Men on a Flying Trapeze in 1932. He and 2 other pilots performed precision formation flying at airshows and training demonstrations across the country, showcasing the kind of coordination and skill he believed pursuit aviation required. The team earned national publicity and established Chennault's reputation as one of the finest formation pilots in the service. In 1935, he published his ideas in a textbook titled The Role of Defensive Pursuit. The book laid out in systematic detail how pursuit forces could be organized, trained, and employed to defeat attacking bomber formations. It described early warning networks, scramble procedures, intercept tactics, and attack formations. It was a comprehensive manual for the air defense doctrine that Chennault believed the Air Corps desperately needed. The bomber generals were not interested. The leadership of the Air Corps had committed themselves to strategic bombing as the service's primary mission and identity. They did not want to hear that their precious bombers could be stopped by the very pursuit aircraft they were trying to marginalize. Chennault's arguments were dismissed as the ramblings of a pursuit pilot who refused to accept that his specialty was obsolete. His textbook was ignored by the curriculum committees. His demonstrations were praised for their flying skill but dismissed as irrelevant to modern warfare. Chennault refused to accept defeat. He continued arguing his case at every opportunity, in classrooms and conferences, in papers and presentations, in private conversations with anyone who would listen. He made powerful enemies among the bomber advocates who controlled the service's future. He was labeled a troublemaker, a malcontent, an officer who could not accept the direction the Air Corps was moving. By 1937, his position had become untenable. His chronic bronchitis, developed from years of flying open cockpit aircraft in all weather conditions, left him frequently short of breath and barely able to lecture. He had developed partial deafness from exposure to unmuffled engines, making it difficult to communicate in noisy environments. His flight surgeons had repeatedly recommended that he be grounded and removed from flying status. He was passed over for promotion. His superiors made abundantly clear that his career had no future. On April 30, 1937, Claire Lee Chennault retired from the United States Army Air Corps. He held the permanent rank of captain, though he had been promoted to major. He was 43 years old, apparently finished with military aviation forever. The service he had devoted 2 decades of his life to had rejected him and everything he stood for. The very next day, May 1st, 1937, he received an offer that would change his life and alter the course of the war in Asia. China had been sliding toward full-scale war with Japan for years. Japanese forces had occupied Manchuria in 1931 and established the puppet state of Manchukuo. Tensions escalated steadily through the mid-30s, and in July 1937, fighting erupted at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing. Within weeks, Japan had launched a full-scale invasion of China. The Chinese Air Force was being systematically annihilated. Most of its aircraft were obsolete biplanes that stood no chance against modern Japanese fighters. Its pilots were poorly trained, its maintenance inadequate, its leadership incompetent. Japanese bombers ranged freely over Chinese cities, killing tens of thousands of civilians in terror raids designed to break the nation's will to resist. Chongqing, Shanghai, Nanking, Canton, the bombs fell everywhere, and the Chinese could do nothing to stop them. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the nationalist government, desperately needed someone who could rebuild his shattered air force. Through a network of intermediaries that included Chinese officials and American adventurers, an offer reached Claire Chennault. Would he come to China as an aviation advisor? The salary would be $1,000 per month, nearly 3 times what the army had paid him. He would have a 3-month contract to survey the Chinese Air Force and recommend improvements. Chennault accepted immediately. He arrived in Shanghai in June 1937, carrying a passport that identified him as a farmer. Within weeks of his arrival, the war that had been simmering for years exploded into full-scale combat. He would not leave China for 8 years. What Chennault found confirmed everything he believed about air combat. The Chinese Air Force was in even worse condition than he had expected. Corrupt officials had embezzled maintenance funds. Pilots falsified training records to avoid the danger of actual flying. Aircraft sat useless on airfields because no one knew how to maintain them. It would take years to build a competent Chinese Air Force from this wreckage. But Chennault also found an opportunity to study the Japanese enemy up close. He observed their tactics, analyzed their formations, and debriefed Chinese pilots who had survived encounters with them. He examined the wreckage of downed Japanese aircraft, measuring, weighing, and calculating performance characteristics. He built an extensive intelligence picture of Japanese aviation that no one in the American military establishment possessed, and he began constructing the early warning network that would become essential to his later success. Across Chinese-controlled territory, he organized hundreds of ground observers, peasants and villagers, equipped with radios or telephones, trained to identify aircraft types and report their direction and altitude. When Japanese bombers approached, the warning would flow through this network to Chennault's headquarters, giving defending fighters precious time to get airborne and climb to altitude. The Chinese called it the Jing Bao system, and it would prove as important as any weapon in Chennault's arsenal. The Japanese relied heavily on highly maneuverable fighters, first the Nakajima Ki-27, called Nate by Allied intelligence, and later the legendary Mitsubishi A-6M0. These aircraft could outturn anything the Allies flew. Japanese pilots were trained from their first days in aviation to fight in horizontal turning combat, circling with an enemy at relatively low speeds, until one pilot made a mistake and gave the other a shooting opportunity. In this kind of traditional dogfight, Japanese fighters were nearly unbeatable. Allied pilots who tried to turn with them died. But the Japanese aircraft achieved their extraordinary maneuverability by sacrificing everything else. They carried no armor plate to protect the pilot from enemy fire. They had no self-sealing fuel tanks to prevent catastrophic fires when bullets punctured their wing cells. Their airframes were so lightly built, using thin aluminum skin and minimal structural bracing, that a few rounds from heavy machine guns could tear them apart. A single burst that would merely damage an American fighter could disintegrate a Zero, and critically, these nimble fighters paid a severe penalty at high speed. The Zero's control surfaces, which responded with feather-light touch at low speeds, began stiffening at around 200 miles per hour and became extremely heavy by 275. The aircraft became difficult to maneuver, almost uncontrollable in a dive. Its famous rate of roll, which allowed Japanese pilots to reverse direction almost instantaneously at combat speeds, dropped dramatically at high velocity. It took a Zero nearly 6 seconds to complete a half roll at high speed. An American P-40 could do the same maneuver in less than 2 seconds. Chennault saw the solution clearly. The answer was not to build a fighter that could outturn the Japanese. That was impossible. The answer was to refuse to fight the Japanese on their terms. Use the advantages your aircraft actually possesses. Altitude, dive speed, roll rate, firepower, structural strength. Attack from above at high speed. Dive through the enemy formation with guns blazing. Do not try to turn. Do not slow down. Keep diving, using your superior speed to escape before the enemy can react. Then climb back up to altitude and do it again. Never turn with a Japanese fighter. Never slow down to their preferred fighting speed. Never let them maneuver onto your tail in a circling fight where their advantages could be brought to bear. Hit and run. Boom and zoom. Dive away. It contradicted every instinct a fighter pilot possessed. It felt like cowardice, like running from a fight. Fighter pilots were trained to pursue, to close with the enemy, to maneuver for the kill. Chennault was telling them to run away, but running away at the right moment was how you survived to fight again. Running away at 400 miles per hour when your enemy could only manage 300 was not cowardice. It was tactics. By 1940, Chennault was convinced that American aircraft and American pilots, properly trained in his diving tactics, could defeat the Japanese. He needed the resources to prove it. Through an elaborate series of negotiations involving Chinese officials, American military officers, and Roosevelt administration insiders, he began building what would become the American Volunteer Group. In April 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt authorized the recruitment of American military pilots to fly for China. The authorization came through informal channels involving White House economist Lachlan Curry and lobbyist Tommy Corcoran. This was an extraordinary step for a nation still officially at peace. The pilots would have to resign their commissions and sign contracts with a front company called the Central Aircraft Manufacturing Company. They would be civilians, technically mercenaries working for the Chinese government. But everyone involved understood that this was an American operation with American backing. Recruiters fanned out to Army airfields, Navy air stations, and Marine Corps bases across the country. They offered adventure, good pay, and the chance to fight the Japanese while America officially remained neutral. The base salary was $600 per month for pilots, with an additional $500 bonus for each confirmed aerial victory. The money was attractive, but many volunteers were motivated more by patriotism and the desire to fight than by financial considerations. 100 Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk fighters were diverted from a British order and shipped to Burma in crates. Only 99 arrived, one having been damaged in transit. The aircraft began arriving in Rangoon in the summer of 1941, where they were assembled by technicians from the Central Aircraft Manufacturing Company. The P-40 was not the best fighter in the world. It was slower than the Zero, climbed more slowly, turned more slowly, could not match the Japanese fighter's range. But it was rugged, armed with 2 heavy 50 caliber machine guns in the nose and 4 30 caliber guns in the wings, and possessed excellent dive characteristics. Most importantly, it had pilot armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. A P-40 pilot who got hit had a chance to survive. A Zero pilot who got hit usually died. Approximately 100 pilots and 200 ground crew personnel gathered at a remote British airfield at Taungoo in central Burma for training. They came from the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. Some were seasoned aviators with years of experience. Others had exaggerated their qualifications to get hired and barely knew how to fly the powerful P-40. Chennault did not care about their past. He cared about what they could learn. He set up a schoolhouse at Taungoo and began the most intensive training program any of them had ever experienced. For 72 hours over several weeks, he lectured his pilots on Japanese aircraft, tactics, and doctrine. He showed them silhouettes of every Japanese plane they might encounter. He explained the weaknesses of the Zero and the key 27 inches exhaustive detail. He drilled into them the principles of his diving attacks until they could recite them in their sleep. The rules were simple. Never dogfight. Never try to outturn a Japanese fighter. Always maintain speed advantage. Always attack from above. Dive through the enemy formation, fire a quick burst, and keep diving. Use your superior dive rate and roll rate to escape before they can react. Work in pairs, with wingmen protecting each other. Never get separated. Never get slow. The pilots called him the Old Man. His face was weathered to the texture of old leather from years of flying open cockpits under tropical suns. His voice was gravelly from the bronchitis that still plagued him. He smoked constantly, lighting one cigarette from the butt of the last. He drove his men hard, demanding perfection in formation flying, gunnery, and tactical maneuvering. He seemed to know everything about the Japanese before any of his pilots had ever seen one. By November 1941, the American volunteer group was organized into 3 squadrons of roughly 25 pilots each. The 1st Pursuit Squadron called themselves the Adam and Eves, their insignia an apple with a prominent bite. The 2nd Pursuit Squadron were the Panda Bears. The 3rd Pursuit Squadron chose Hell's Angels, after the 1930 Howard Hughes film about World War I aviators. They painted shark teeth on the noses of their P-40 seconds, copying a design pilot Charles Bond had seen in photographs of British Noma 112 squadron fighters operating in the North African desert. The teeth went perfectly with the P-40's distinctive chin-mounted radiator intake, transforming the aircraft into a predatory monster. It was intimidating. It was distinctive. It would become one of the most recognizable images of the Pacific War. They were ready. They just needed someone to fight. Then came Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941, changed everything. The Japanese attack on Hawaii brought America into the war and transformed the American volunteer group from an obscure mercenary unit into a vital military asset. Simultaneously with Pearl Harbor, Japan launched attacks across the Pacific, the Philippines, Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, Malaya, Thailand. Within days, Japanese forces would be threatening Burma, and with it, the only remaining supply route into China. Chennault positioned his squadrons at opposite ends of the Burma Road. 2 squadrons, the Adam and Eves and the Panda Bears, were based at Kunming, the Chinese terminus of the road. The Hells Angels were stationed at Mingaladon Airfield near Rangoon, working alongside British Commonwealth forces to defend the port through which all supplies for China had to flow. His early warning network was ready, hundreds of observers spread across the region, watching the skies, ready to report approaching aircraft. When the Japanese came, his pilots would have warning. They would have time to get airborne and climb to altitude. They would have the advantage. On December 20th, 1941, 13 days after Pearl Harbor, they got their chance. The attack on Kunming came from Japanese Army Air Force bombers based at Gia Lam Airfield near Hanoi in French Indochina. 10 Kawasaki Ki-48 twin-engine bombers, fast and modern by Japanese standards, took off in the early morning darkness. They had bombed Kunming many times before without opposition. The fighter escort that accompanied them turned back at the Chinese border, deemed unnecessary against a city that could not fight back. But Chennault's observer network tracked them every mile of the way. Reports flowed in by radio and telephone, tracking the bombers' course, speed, and altitude. By the time the Japanese crossed into Chinese airspace, the pilots of the Adam and Eves and Panda Bears were already in their cockpits, engines running and waiting for the order to take off. 16 P-40 seconds climbed into the morning sky and positioned themselves between the approaching bombers and the rising sun. The Japanese crews, squinting into the glare, never saw them coming. The first diving pass hit the bomber formation like a thunderbolt. American pilots screamed down from above at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, their machine guns blazing. They did not try to turn. They did not slow down to engage. They slashed through the formation exactly as Chennault had taught them, firing short bursts, then kept diving, away from the enemy, away from any possibility of a turning fight. The Japanese bombers scattered in confusion. Within minutes, 3 were falling from the sky, burning, disintegrating, and their crews dead. A 4th staggered toward home trailing smoke from multiple hits. It crashed before reaching Indochina. Later, Chinese intelligence would intercept Japanese communications confirming that only 1 of the 10 bombers returned to base. 1 P-40 ran out of fuel during the engagement, and crash landed in a rice paddy. The pilot walked away uninjured. It was the only American loss of the battle. The citizens of Kunming, who had endured years of unopposed bombing, poured into the streets to celebrate. For the first time, the Japanese had been stopped. For the first time, their bombers had been destroyed. The mayor organized a procession to the airfield to thank the American pilots. The Chinese press reported that the defenders had fought like flying tigers. The name stuck. 3 days later, on December 23rd, the Hells Angels got their baptism of fire over Rangoon. Japanese bombers, escorted by key 27 fighters, attacked in waves. The 3rd Squadron put just 14 P-40 seconds into the air, joined by British Brewster Buffaloes and Hawker Hurricanes. The American pilots followed Chennault's tactics precisely. They ignored the nimble Japanese fighters and dove through the bomber formations again and again, their heavy machine guns tearing apart the lightly built aircraft. When Japanese fighters got on their tails, they simply dove away, leaving the frustrated enemy behind. The Japanese lost at least 15 aircraft confirmed, with many more probably destroyed. The Flying Tigers suffered casualties, but had proven that Chennault's tactics worked against determined opposition. On Christmas Day, the Japanese threw everything they had at Rangoon. 63 bombers escorted by 25 fighters, including the nimble Ki-43 Oscars of Colonel Tateo Kato's elite 64th Sentai, attacked in 3 waves, determined to overwhelm the defenders by sheer numbers. The Flying Tigers put just 14 P-40 seconds into the air against this force, outnumbered more than 6 to 1. Using the diving attacks Chennault had drilled into them, the American pilots tore through the enemy formations again and again. Every pass was executed exactly as trained. Dive from above. Fire a burst. Keep diving. Climb back up. Repeat. The Japanese could not adapt. Their fighters, trained for turning combat, could not catch the Americans who refused to turn. Their bombers, lacking armor and self-sealing tanks, disintegrated under the concentrated fire. Robert Duke Hedman achieved ace status that Christmas morning, shooting down 5 Japanese aircraft in under 15 minutes over Rangoon. He pursued the bombers so far out over the Gulf of Thailand that he landed with barely 5 gallons of fuel remaining, his P-40 riddled with bullet holes, and his ammunition completely spent. He had ignored his fuel gauge in the heat of combat, pressing the attack until he had nothing left to give. When the smoke cleared, 35 Japanese aircraft were confirmed destroyed, with many more probable. The Flying Tigers lost pilots in combat and several aircraft damaged beyond repair, but they had once again proven that a small force using superior tactics could defeat a much larger enemy. The pattern held through the desperate months that followed. The Japanese advanced relentlessly through Burma, overwhelming British and Commonwealth forces, pushing toward the vital port of Rangoon. The Flying Tigers retreated from airfield to airfield, always outnumbered, always short of spare parts and replacement aircraft. They cannibalized wrecked P-40 seconds to keep others flying. They built dummy aircraft from bamboo and rice straw to draw enemy strafing attacks away from their real planes hidden under the trees. At one point in late February, only 10 operational P-40 seconds remained to face hundreds of Japanese aircraft. Yet even in these darkest hours, the diving tactics continued to produce victories. Japanese pilots trained in horizontal turning combat simply could not adapt to an enemy who refused to turn. They would get on an American's tail, begin closing for the kill, and watch helplessly as the P-40 rolled and dove away at speeds no Japanese fighter could match. Pilot David Lee Tex Hill, a former Navy dive bomber pilot from Texas, became one of the leading aces of the group, eventually credited with more than 10 confirmed victories during his AVG service. Robert Neale, commander of the Adam and Eves, topped all AVG pilots with 13 confirmed kills. Charles Older, who would later become a prominent judge in Los Angeles and preside over the Charles Manson murder trial, recorded more than 10 victories. The tactics that produced these results required iron discipline and the suppression of every fighter pilot's natural instinct to turn and fight. Always attack from above, always maintain speed advantage, always dive away rather than turning to dogfight. The P-40 could sustain dives exceeding 480 miles per hour. Japanese fighters became almost uncontrollable above 300. That difference of nearly 200 miles per hour was the margin between life and death. The American volunteer group officially disbanded on July 4, 1942, exactly 1 year after the effective date of their contracts. The men had done what they signed up to do. Now the regular Army Air Forces were taking over operations in China. Some pilots accepted commissions in the newly formed 23rd Fighter Group, which would continue using the Flying Tiger's name and shark-tooth nose art as part of Chennault's 14th Air Force. Others returned to their original services. A few went home to civilian life. In just 7 months of combat, from December 20th, 1941 to July 4th, 1942, the original American volunteer group had destroyed 296 confirmed Japanese aircraft, with another several hundred probably destroyed. Only 4 pilots were lost in aerial combat. Others died from ground fire during strafing runs, accidents and illness, bringing total fatalities to around 24. The air-to-air combat record they achieved under impossible conditions remains one of the most remarkable in aviation history. Claire Chennault was recalled to active duty in April 1942 and promoted to Brigadier General. He commanded first the China Air Task Force and then the 14th Air Force through the rest of the war, continuing to feud with superiors over strategy and resources. He never learned to play the political games required for advancement in the military hierarchy. When the war ended, he was quietly pushed into retirement once again. He returned to China and founded Civil Air Transport, a commercial airline that became entangled with CIA covert operations during the Chinese Civil War and later conflicts. In 1947, he divorced Neale, his wife of 35 years, and married Anna Chan, a Chinese journalist more than 2 decades his junior. They had 2 daughters. The chronic bronchitis that had plagued Chennault his entire adult life eventually developed into lung cancer. On July 18, 1958, 9 days before his death, he was promoted to the honorary rank of Lieutenant General by special act of Congress. He died on July 27 at Ochsner Foundation Hospital in New Orleans and was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. He was 64 years old. The tactics he developed outlived him by generations. The principles of energy management in air combat, of using vertical maneuvers rather than horizontal turns, of attacking from altitude and extending at high speed, became fundamental doctrine in fighter aviation. Every pilot who ever used altitude advantage to bounce an enemy, dove through a formation firing, and continued diving rather than turning to dogfight, was following the template that Chennault established in the skies over China. But the true legacy of the Flying Tigers transcends tactics. It demonstrates what a small group of determined individuals can accomplish against overwhelming odds when they refuse to accept what everyone else believes is possible. The American military establishment believed that pursuit aviation was obsolete. The Japanese believed their fighters were invincible in combat. Every accepted piece of knowledge said that a handful of volunteer pilots in inferior aircraft could not stop the Japanese air offensive. Claire Chennault disagreed. He spent years developing theories that his superiors dismissed as fantasy. He watched his career destroyed because he refused to conform to conventional wisdom, and when he finally got the chance to prove his ideas in combat, he did so with results that exceeded anything even he had predicted. The men who flew for him transformed from skeptics to believers through the brutal crucible of combat. They learned to trust the diving attack even when instinct screamed at them to turn and fight. They learned that breaking off combat was not cowardice but tactical wisdom. They learned that the crackpot everyone had dismissed had understood something fundamental about aerial warfare that no one else saw. Sometimes the only way to win an impossible fight is to refuse to fight it on the enemy's terms. December 20th, 1941. Shortly after dawn, the skies above Kunming, China, 16 shark-mouthed fighters climb toward the sun, positioning themselves above a formation of Japanese bombers that has never been challenged over this city. The dive begins. Engines screaming, machine guns blazing, 400 miles per hour and accelerating. The Japanese formation shatters. Bombers fall burning from the sky, and the American pilots do not turn to press their advantage in a swirling dogfight. They keep diving, away from the enemy, away from the trap of the turning fight, down toward the earth and then climbing again, back toward the sun, ready to dive once more. It looks like running away. It sounds like cowardice. It is the most effective fighter tactic of the Pacific War, and it is the reason that a small band of American volunteers flying P-40 Tomahawks achieved an extraordinary kill ratio against the most successful air force in the world. They did it by following one simple rule that an old Texan with a leathery face had spent his entire career trying to teach. Never fight the enemy on his terms. Dive away. And win.